When my son asked for my entire life savings to pay for his wedding, I said yes. When his fiancée rolled her eyes and said it still wouldn't be enough for what they really wanted, I smiled and nodded. When they handed me a payment plan for a wedding that cost more than my house, I signed it without arguing. 3 weeks later, I walked into the Henderson Community Foundation and donated every single penny of my life savings. All $127,000 of it. The look on their faces when they found out? Priceless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Alexa Martinez, and I was 64 years old when I learned that 37 years of teaching elementary school meant absolutely nothing to the two people I loved most in this world. I lived in Henderson, Nevada, in a ranch-style house I'd bought with my late husband Miguel back in 1987. The mortgage had been paid off for 12 years, the desert landscaping required minimal water, and every room held memories that money couldn't buy. The walls were painted in soft earth tones that Miguel had chosen, because he said they reminded him of the sunsets we used to watch from our back patio. That patio faced west, and every evening the sky would explode in colors that made the Las Vegas Strip seemed dim by comparison. I wasn't wealthy, but I was comfortable. 37 years of teaching third grade had taught me the value of saving every dollar, planning for tomorrow, and living within my means. My pension wasn't enormous, but it covered my needs. My house was modest but well-maintained. My 2018 Honda Civic was reliable and economical. I shopped with coupons, grew tomatoes and peppers in my backyard, and found joy in simple pleasures that didn't require a credit card. Miguel had been gone for 8 years, taken by cancer that no amount of money could have prevented. We'd faced that battle together, using up most of our emergency fund for treatments that gave us 2 extra years I wouldn't trade for anything. After he passed, I rebuilt my savings slowly, steadily, one Social Security check and pension payment at a time. The money sat in a savings account at Nevada State Bank, earning modest interest but growing consistently. Every month I deposited what I could spare, sometimes $50, sometimes $200. It wasn't about getting rich. It was about security, about knowing that if my air conditioning failed in the brutal Nevada heat, or if my roof needed repair after a rare desert storm, I could handle it without panicking. That nest egg represented decades of brown bag lunches, generic brand groceries, and vacations that never strayed far from home. It represented the financial discipline Miguel and I had learned from our parents, who had survived the Depression, and understood that money saved was money earned. I volunteered at the Henderson Community Center 3 days a week, helping adults earn their GEDs and teaching basic computer skills to seniors who wanted to stay connected with their families. The work didn't pay anything, but it filled the hours that would have otherwise felt empty without Miguel's laughter echoing through the house. I'd been doing it for 6 years, ever since my retirement, and the relationships I'd built there had become some of my most treasured friendships. Linda Chen, who ran the literacy program, had become like a sister to me. We met for coffee every Tuesday morning at a small cafe near the community center, sharing stories about our students and our families. My son Ryan lived in Las Vegas proper, about 20 minutes away in one of those new developments with houses that all look the same, and homeowner association fees that cost more than I spent on groceries in 3 months. He worked for a tech company doing something with data analysis that I never fully understood, but it paid well enough for him to afford a house with a 3-car garage and a pool he never used. He'd married Jessica 2 years earlier in a small ceremony at a local chapel. Nothing fancy, just immediate family and a dinner afterward at a nice restaurant. I'd offered to help pay for that wedding, but they'd insisted they wanted to keep it simple and intimate. I respected that. I thought it showed maturity and practicality. Jessica worked in marketing for a company that helped restaurants build their social media presence. She was always taking pictures of her food, her outfits, their weekend activities. Everything was documented, filtered, and shared with an audience I couldn't see, but that seemed to influence every decision they made. She was beautiful in the way that required effort, with perfectly styled hair, manicured nails, and clothes that looked expensive even when she claimed they were on sale. I never questioned her choices, but I sometimes wondered if she ever just sat quietly without needing to photograph the moment. They lived in a world I didn't fully understand, where experiences were measured by how they looked on a screen rather than how they felt in your heart. Their conversations often revolved around brands, trends, and what other people were doing. They went to restaurants that charged $30 for a plate of pasta I could make for $3 at home. They bought furniture that was stylish, but uncomfortable, cars that were impressive but impractical, and gadgets that were replaced before they wore out. I didn't judge their lifestyle, but I didn't understand it either. Ryan had been the center of my world for so long that I'd forgotten how to exist without worrying about his happiness. When he was little, I'd saved for months to buy him the bicycle he wanted for his birthday. When he was in high school, I'd worked summer jobs tutoring other children so I could afford to send him to basketball camp. When he went to college, I'd eaten ramen noodles for dinner more nights than I cared to admit, so I could help with his expenses without taking on debt. Sacrifice had become so natural to me that I barely noticed when I was doing it. Miguel used to worry that I gave too much of myself to Ryan, that I needed to save some energy and resources for my own dreams and needs. He wasn't wrong, but I couldn't help myself. Ryan was our only child, born after years of trying and several heartbreaking miscarriages. When he finally arrived, healthy and perfect, I made a silent vow to give him every opportunity I could afford, and some I couldn't. Miguel supported my devotion to our son, but he also reminded me that teaching a child to receive everything wasn't the same as teaching them to appreciate anything. The house where I'd raised Ryan still held traces of his childhood. There were height marks penciled on the doorframe between the kitchen and the living room, marking his growth from age 3 to 18. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His high school graduation photo sat on the mantel next to pictures of Miguel and me on our wedding day. A box in the spare bedroom closet held his old report cards, art projects, and sports trophies. I'd kept everything, unable to let go of the physical reminders of the years when his biggest problems were homework assignments and friendship drama. After Miguel died, Ryan had been attentive for a while. He called regularly, visited on weekends, helped me navigate the paperwork that comes with losing a spouse. But as time passed and his own life grew busier, the calls became less frequent and the visits more rushed. I understood. He had his own responsibilities, his own relationship to nurture. I didn't want to be the needy mother who demanded more attention than her adult child could give. I learned to fill my days with activities that didn't depend on anyone else's schedule or availability. The community center became my second home. I arrived every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9 in the morning and stayed until 3 in the afternoon. The students I worked with ranged in age from 18 to 75, all of them working toward goals that education could help them achieve. Some wanted better jobs, others wanted to help their children with homework. A few simply wanted to prove to themselves that they could still learn new things. Their determination inspired me and reminded me that growth didn't stop at any particular age. Linda often joked that I should be paid for the work I did, that my patience and skill with difficult students made me worth my weight in gold. But I didn't want payment. The satisfaction of watching someone master a concept they'd struggled with for weeks was reward enough. The thank you cards I received when students passed their GED exams were treasures I kept in a special box on my bedroom dresser. Each one represented a life changed, a future brightened, a dream fulfilled. I lived simply but contentedly. My morning routine started with coffee on the back patio, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold. I read the newspaper cover to cover, something that seemed old-fashioned to people who got their news from their phones. I maintained a small garden where I grew the vegetables that thrived in the desert climate: tomatoes, peppers, and herbs that I used in the meals I cooked for one but always made enough for leftovers. My evenings were spent reading library books, watching classic movies, or working on jigsaw puzzles that took weeks to complete. I talked to my neighbor Bob Williams over the fence that separated our backyards. He was a retired mechanic who kept my car running smoothly and refused to let me pay him for simple maintenance. Our conversations covered everything from the weather to politics to the memories we shared of Henderson when it was smaller and quieter. Money wasn't something I thought about often, but I was always aware of it. Every purchase was considered carefully. Every bill was paid on time. Every dollar saved was a small victory against the uncertainty that had haunted my parents' generation. I tracked my expenses in a small notebook, not because I was obsessive, but because I wanted to understand where my money went and make sure it aligned with my values. The savings account that held my life's work grew slowly but steadily, like the desert plants in my yard that thrived despite the harsh conditions. I never imagined that the financial security I'd worked so hard to build would become a source of conflict with the person I loved most. I never thought that the values Miguel and I had tried to instill in our son would be challenged so directly. I never anticipated that the simple act of saving money would put me at odds with the family I'd sacrificed so much to support. But life has a way of testing your assumptions when you least expect it, and my test was coming whether I was ready for it or not. The call came on a Tuesday evening in March. I was watering my tomato plants when my phone rang, and I almost didn't answer because my hands were dirty, and I was enjoying the peaceful routine of caring for something that would eventually nourish me. But I saw Ryan's name on the screen and wiped my hands on my jeans before picking up. His voice sounded different, excited but nervous, like he was about to ask for something he wasn't sure he'd receive. He told me that he and Jessica had decided to renew their wedding vows for their second anniversary. They wanted to do it right this time, he said, with all the elements they'd skipped the first time around. A real ceremony, a real reception, real flowers, real photographers, a real celebration that would properly mark the beginning of their married life. They'd found the perfect venue, a resort in Lake Tahoe that specialized in destination weddings. The ceremony would be held outdoors overlooking the lake, followed by a reception in a ballroom that could accommodate 200 guests. 200 guests. I tried to wrap my mind around that number. Miguel and I had invited 40 people to our wedding, and we'd thought that was extravagant. Ryan was talking about a celebration that would cost more than most people's annual salary, and he was describing it like it was a necessity rather than a luxury. I listened without interrupting, trying to understand how a marriage that was already legal and blessed needed to be validated again with such an elaborate display. The excitement in Ryan's voice was genuine, and I found myself caught up in his enthusiasm despite my confusion about the expense. If this was what would make him happy, if this was what he and Jessica needed to feel properly married, then I wanted to support them. I asked about the cost, not because I was unwilling to help, but because I wanted to understand the scope of what they were planning. The number he gave me made my knees weak. $85,000. For one day. For one party. I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair and tried to process what he'd just told me. That was more than I'd spent on my house when I bought it 35 years ago. That was more than I'd spent on Ryan's entire education from kindergarten through college. That was nearly 2/3 of everything I'd managed to save in 64 years of careful living. Ryan seemed to interpret my silence as shock over the amount, and he quickly assured me that they didn't expect me to pay for all of it. They'd been saving too, he said, and they had about $20,000 set aside. Jessica's parents were contributing $30,000. They just needed help with the remaining $35,000, and they'd thought of me because they knew. I'd been saving for years and probably had some money tucked away for emergencies or special occasions. $35,000. The number echoed in my head as I tried to find words to respond. That was more than my annual pension. That was money I'd planned to use for home repairs, medical expenses, or the possibility that I might someday need assisted living care. That was money that represented security, peace of mind, the ability to face whatever challenges aging might bring without becoming a burden to anyone. But it was also money that could make my son happy. Money that could give him and Jessica the celebration they wanted, the memories they'd treasure, the photographs they'd share with their children someday. I thought about all the times I'd chosen his happiness over my own comfort, all the sacrifices that had felt natural and necessary, because that's what mothers do. This felt different, bigger, but the principle was the same. If I had something he needed, how could I refuse to give it? I told him I'd think about it, that I needed to look at my finances and see what was possible. He sounded relieved and grateful, like he'd been worried I might say no immediately. He promised to send me details about the venue and the plans they'd made, information that would help me understand why this celebration was so important to them. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen as the sun set behind the mountains, trying to reconcile the practical voice in my head with the loving voice in my heart. The materials Ryan sent me arrived by email the next morning. Glossy photos of the Lake Tahoe resort, with pristine beaches and manicured lawns that looked like something from a magazine. Details about the ceremony location, the reception menu, the flowers, the photographers, the transportation for guests, the accommodation packages. Everything was beautiful, elegant, perfectly planned. Everything was also breathtakingly expensive. I spent hours going through my financial records, calculating exactly how much I could afford to contribute without compromising my own security. $35,000 would require me to liquidate most of my savings, leaving me with barely enough to cover a major emergency. It would mean trusting that my health would remain stable, that my house would require no significant repairs, that no unexpected expenses would arise in the years ahead. It felt reckless, but it also felt like what a loving mother would do. Over the next few days, I found myself thinking constantly about the decision I needed to make. I talked to Linda during our Tuesday coffee, carefully avoiding specific details, but asking general questions about family obligations and financial priorities. She listened with the patience of someone who'd raised 4 children of her own, nodding at the right moments and asking gentle questions that helped me clarify my own thoughts. Linda didn't tell me what to do, but she did remind me that love could be expressed in many ways, and that the most expensive gesture wasn't necessarily the most meaningful one. She talked about the difference between helping someone achieve a goal and enabling someone to avoid the natural consequences of their choices. Her words stayed with me as I continued to wrestle with my decision, adding layers of complexity to what I'd initially seen as a simple question of whether I could afford to help. I drove past Ryan and Jessica's house one evening, not to spy or intrude, but just to see the life they'd built together. The house was beautiful, with professional landscaping and a luxury car in the driveway. Through the windows, I could see elegant furniture and expensive electronics. They clearly weren't struggling financially. They weren't facing hardship or emergency. They simply wanted something extravagant and expected others to help them pay for it. That realization didn't make me angry, but it did make me thoughtful. I remembered the years when Miguel and I had wanted things we couldn't afford, and how we'd either found ways to earn the extra money or chosen to do without. We'd never asked our parents to fund our desires, partly because they didn't have money to spare, but mostly because we understood that wanting something wasn't the same as deserving it or needing it. The more I thought about Ryan's request, the more I found myself questioning not just whether I could afford to help, but whether helping was actually the right thing to do. Was I supporting his happiness or enabling his entitlement? Was I showing love or avoiding conflict? Was I helping him build a marriage or funding a performance designed to impress people whose opinions shouldn't matter more than financial responsibility? These questions swirled in my mind as I went through my daily routines, teaching computer skills to seniors who were grateful for free instruction, helping GED students master math concepts they'd struggled with for years, listening to stories from people who'd overcome real hardships to pursue their educational goals. The contrast between their attitude toward money and Ryan's couldn't have been starker. My students understood the value of every dollar because they'd earned every dollar the hard way. Ryan seemed to view money as something that materialized when you needed it, regardless of who had worked to earn it. 2 weeks after Ryan's initial call, I made my decision. I would give him the money he'd asked for, not because I thought it was wise, but because I loved him and wanted him to be happy. I would liquidate most of my savings account and trust that somehow everything would work out. I would choose generosity over prudence and hope that my sacrifice would be appreciated and remembered. But before I could call Ryan to share my decision, Jessica called me. Her voice had an edge I'd never heard before, a sharpness that made me immediately defensive even though I hadn't done anything wrong. She wanted to discuss the wedding plans, she said, and she had some concerns about the budget that Ryan had shared with me. The conversation that followed changed everything. Jessica's voice carried a tone I'd never heard before, crisp and businesslike, as if she were negotiating a corporate deal rather than discussing a family celebration. She thanked me for considering their request, but then launched into a detailed explanation of why $35,000 wouldn't actually be sufficient for the wedding they had envisioned. The venue costs had increased since their initial quote, she explained. The floral arrangements they wanted were more expensive than anticipated. The photographer they'd fallen in love with charged premium rates. The catering options they preferred exceeded their original budget estimates. As Jessica spoke, I felt my stomach drop with each additional expense she mentioned. What had started as a request for $35,000 was now approaching $50,000. She spoke about these increased costs as if they were unavoidable facts of nature rather than choices they were making. The upgraded floral package wasn't just wanted, it was needed. The premium photographer wasn't just preferred, he was essential. The enhanced catering menu wasn't just desired, it was required for the caliber of event they were hosting. I found myself gripping the phone tighter as Jessica continued her presentation. She had clearly prepared for this conversation, armed with specific numbers and justifications for each expense. She talked about the importance of making the right impression on Ryan's colleagues, who would be attending the ceremony. She emphasized how this celebration would set the tone for their entire marriage and future social standing. She mentioned other couples they knew who had spent similar amounts on their weddings, as if peer pressure was a valid financial planning strategy. What struck me most was how Jessica framed the conversation. She never directly asked for more money, but she painted a picture of a celebration that couldn't possibly succeed without additional funding. She spoke about compromises they'd have to make, disappointments they'd have to endure, and opportunities they'd have to sacrifice if the budget remained limited. Her approach was subtle, but unmistakable. She was laying the groundwork for a larger request while making me feel responsible for any shortcomings in their perfect day. I tried to interject several times, wanting to ask practical questions about why certain expenses were necessary or whether alternatives had been considered. But Jessica had momentum, and she seemed determined to present her complete case before allowing any discussion. She talked about the dress she'd selected, which cost more than I'd spent on my car. She described the cake they'd chosen, which required a specialty baker and ingredients that had to be imported. She outlined the entertainment they'd booked, including a live band and a professional DJ for different portions of the evening. Every detail she shared reinforced the same message. This wasn't just a wedding, it was an investment in their future happiness and social success. The money wasn't being spent frivolously, it was being allocated strategically to create an experience that would pay dividends in terms of relationships, opportunities, and memories. Jessica spoke about their wedding as if it were a business venture rather than a personal celebration, calculating returns on investment and measuring success by metrics I didn't understand. When she finally paused for my response, I felt overwhelmed by the sheer scope of what they were planning. This wasn't the simple vow renewal ceremony Ryan had initially described. This was an elaborate production designed to impress people I'd never met with money I'd spent decades accumulating. I asked Jessica to slow down and help me understand how the costs had grown so dramatically from the original estimate. Her explanation revealed a pattern of decision-making that made me deeply uncomfortable. Ryan and Jessica had apparently started with a basic package and then upgraded every component as they researched their options. The standard floral arrangement became premium when they saw more elaborate options. The basic photography package became deluxe when they learned about additional services. The simple reception dinner became a multi-course tasting menu when they toured other venues and saw what was possible. Each upgrade was justified by the reasoning that this was a once-in-a-lifetime event that deserved the very best. Jessica spoke about the importance of not having regrets, of not looking back and wishing they'd done things differently. She emphasized that they'd rather start their renewed marriage with debt than with disappointment, as if those were the only two options available. I asked about the possibility of reducing some expenses, of finding ways to create a beautiful celebration within their original budget. Jessica's response was polite but firm. They'd already researched less expensive alternatives, she assured me, and the quality difference was significant. The cheaper photographers' portfolios didn't meet their standards. The basic floral packages looked sparse and uninspired. The standard catering options were acceptable, but not memorable. As Jessica spoke, I began to understand that this conversation wasn't really about money. It was about values, priorities, and fundamentally different approaches to life. Jessica viewed their wedding as an opportunity to establish their social credentials and create content for the social media presence that seemed to govern so many of their decisions. Every choice was filtered through the question of how it would look in photographs and how it would be perceived by their network of friends and colleagues. I thought about my own wedding to Miguel, held in a small church with decorations we'd made ourselves, and a reception in the church hall with food prepared by family members. The photographer was Miguel's cousin, who charged us the cost of film and development. My dress was borrowed from my sister, altered to fit by my mother. The flowers came from gardens of friends who were happy to contribute to our celebration. The total cost was less than what Jessica and Ryan wanted to spend on their cake alone. But our wedding had been beautiful, meaningful, and memorable for all the right reasons. People talked for years about the love that filled that little church, the joy that radiated from everyone present, the sense of community that made every guest feel like family. The photographs might not have been magazine quality, but they captured genuine emotions and authentic moments that still brought tears to my eyes decades later. I tried to share some of these thoughts with Jessica, hoping to help her understand that the most meaningful celebrations didn't require the largest budgets. I talked about the weddings I'd attended over the years that remained vivid in my memory, and how none of them were memorable because of their expense. The celebrations I remembered most fondly were distinguished by the love of the couple, the warmth of the community, and the sense of joy that permeated every moment. Jessica listened politely, but I could hear in her voice that my perspective wasn't resonating. She thanked me for sharing my experiences, but then explained that their generation had different expectations and opportunities. Social media had changed the landscape of weddings, she said, making it important to create events that would stand out in a crowded field of shared experiences. Their friends and colleagues would be comparing their celebration to others they'd attended or seen online, and falling short of expectations could impact both their personal relationships and professional networking opportunities. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Jessica gradually increasing the pressure while maintaining a veneer of respectful discussion. She never demanded that I provide the additional funding, but she made it clear that the wedding they'd planned couldn't succeed without it. She spoke about Ryan's excitement for the celebration and how disappointed he would be if they had to scale back their vision. She mentioned how hard they'd both been working to save money for this event, sacrificing other pleasures and opportunities to fund their dream wedding. As Jessica painted this picture of sacrifice and disappointment, I found myself feeling guilty for even questioning their plans. These were two adults who'd made careful decisions about how they wanted to celebrate their marriage. Who was I to judge their priorities or question their choices? If they believed this celebration was worth the investment, and if I had the means to help them achieve their goals, shouldn't I be supportive rather than skeptical? But even as I felt the pull of guilt and obligation, another voice in my head was raising different questions. Why had they committed to expenses they couldn't afford? Why was my financial security being treated as their fallback plan? Why was I being asked to fund choices I would never make for myself? Why were their wants being presented as needs that I was somehow responsible for fulfilling? Jessica seemed to sense my internal struggle, and she shifted her approach from presenting facts to appealing to emotions. She talked about how much this wedding meant to Ryan, how he'd been dreaming of giving her the celebration she deserved ever since their simple courthouse ceremony. She mentioned how proud he was of me, how often he talked about my years of teaching and the way I'd supported his education and career. She suggested that helping them with this celebration would be a way for me to demonstrate my confidence in their marriage and my investment in their future happiness. The emotional manipulation was subtle but effective. Jessica was positioning my financial support not as charity or obligation, but as an expression of love and faith in their relationship. She was suggesting that refusing to help would signal doubt about their marriage or reluctance to support their dreams. She was making it nearly impossible for me to say no without appearing selfish or unsupportive. But the more Jessica spoke, the more I began to recognize the dynamic that was unfolding. This wasn't a request for help with an emergency or an unexpected hardship. This was an expectation that I would fund a lifestyle choice that exceeded their means. They had decided what kind of wedding they wanted, committed to expenses they couldn't afford, and then turned to me to bridge the gap between their desires and their resources. I realized that my initial offer to contribute $35,000 had been interpreted not as generous assistance, but as a starting point for negotiation. Jessica's presentation of increased costs wasn't an explanation, but an expectation that I would adjust my contribution to match their expanded vision. They had apparently assumed that my willingness to help with their original budget indicated unlimited availability of funds for whatever they decided they needed. The conversation took an even more troubling turn when Jessica began discussing the guest list and my role in the celebration. She mentioned that they'd been selective about their invitations, focusing on people who would appreciate the caliber of event they were planning. She suggested that my friends from the community center might not be comfortable at such an upscale venue, and that it might be better for everyone if I kept my guest list small and focused on immediate family. As Jessica spoke about the guest list, I began to understand that this celebration wasn't really about Ryan and Jessica's love for each other. It was about creating an exclusive experience that would enhance their social status and provide content for their carefully curated online presence. The people who had supported them throughout their lives were being evaluated based on their ability to contribute to the aesthetic and social media value of the event. I thought about Linda, who had celebrated Ryan's graduation from college, with genuine joy despite having never met him before that day. I thought about Bob, who had fixed Ryan's car for free when he was a struggling college student. I thought about the other volunteers at the community center, who had listened to my stories about Ryan's accomplishments and shared in my pride without expecting anything in return. These people had been part of my extended family for years, and now they were being deemed unsuitable for Ryan's celebration. The conversation with Jessica lasted nearly 2 hours, and by the end, I felt emotionally drained and deeply conflicted. She had presented her case with the skill of a professional negotiator, appealing to my love for Ryan while simultaneously increasing the financial pressure and reducing my inclusion in the celebration itself. I was being asked to fund an event that I was barely welcome to attend, for the benefit of people who valued my money more than my presence. When Jessica finally ended the call, She did so with the assumption that I would need time to consider their expanded request. She thanked me for being so understanding and supportive, and promised to send me updated planning documents that would help me understand exactly how the additional funds would be allocated. She spoke as if my agreement was inevitable, as if the only question was timing and logistics rather than whether I would actually provide the money they wanted. After hanging up, I sat in my living room as the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, trying to process everything Jessica had told me. The numbers swirled in my head. $50,000, $75,000, including my original commitment, more than half of everything I'd saved in my entire adult life. The money that was supposed to provide security in my old age was being requested to fund a single day of celebration for people who already lived more comfortably than I ever had. I walked outside to my garden, hoping that the familiar routine of tending my plants would help clear my mind. As I watered the tomatoes and peppers I'd grown from seed, I thought about the contrast between the patient process of nurturing something from nothing and the instant gratification that seemed to drive Ryan and Jessica's approach to life. My vegetables grew slowly, requiring daily attention and care, producing fruit that tasted better because of the effort invested in growing it. Their wedding planning seemed to follow the opposite philosophy. If you wanted something, you found a way to buy it immediately, regardless of whether you could afford it. The more I thought about my conversation with Jessica, the more I began to question not just her request for additional funding, but the entire premise of their celebration. Why did a marriage that was already legally and spiritually established need to be validated again with such an elaborate display? Why were they prioritizing the opinions of casual acquaintances over the financial security of the family members they were asking to support them? Why was their happiness being measured by external metrics rather than internal satisfaction? That evening, I called Linda and asked if she could meet me for coffee the next morning. I needed to talk to someone who understood both the value of money and the complexity of family relationships. Linda had navigated similar challenges with her own children over the years, and I trusted her perspective on situations that involved competing loyalties and difficult choices. Over coffee the next morning, I shared the details of my conversation with Jessica, carefully explaining the escalating costs and changing expectations. Linda listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly allowing me to work through my thoughts by speaking them aloud. When I finished, she sat quietly for several minutes before responding. Linda's perspective was both supportive and challenging. She validated my feelings of being manipulated and pressured, but she also encouraged me to consider the long-term implications of whatever decision I made. If I provided the money they were requesting, what message would that send about my boundaries and expectations? If I refused to help, how would that affect my relationship with Ryan and any future grandchildren they might have? We talked about the difference between enabling and supporting, between love and obligation, between generosity and self-preservation. Linda reminded me that I had worked too hard and saved too carefully to liquidate my security for someone else's luxury. She also acknowledged that family relationships were complicated, and that sometimes the most loving thing a parent could do was refuse to rescue their adult children from the consequences of their own choices. Our conversation didn't provide easy answers, but it did help me clarify my own values and priorities. I realized that my discomfort with Jessica's request wasn't just about money. It was about respect, inclusion, and fundamentally different approaches to what mattered in life. I was being asked to fund a celebration that excluded the people I cared about while impressing people who meant nothing to me. I was being expected to sacrifice my financial security to subsidize choices I would never make for myself. As I drove home from coffee with Linda, I knew that I needed to have a direct conversation with Ryan. Jessica had presented their case, but I needed to hear from my son about his true feelings and priorities. I needed to understand whether this elaborate celebration was really his dream, or whether he was being influenced by pressures and expectations that didn't reflect his authentic desires. The call I made to Ryan that afternoon would prove to be one of the most difficult conversations of my entire life, revealing truths about our relationship that I had been too afraid to acknowledge, and forcing me to confront the reality of how my decades of sacrifice had shaped his expectations about what he was entitled to receive from others. The conversation with Ryan shattered something inside me that I didn't even realize was still whole. When I called him that Thursday evening, I expected to find the son I had raised, the boy who used to help me plant seeds in the garden and who once saved his allowance for 3 months to buy me a Mother's Day gift. Instead, I found a stranger who spoke about my life savings as if it were his inheritance that I was selfishly withholding. Ryan's voice carried an irritation that caught me off guard from the moment he answered the phone. Before I could even explain why I was calling, he launched into a complaint about how Jessica had told him I seemed hesitant about supporting their wedding plans. He said he couldn't understand why I would have second thoughts about helping them create the celebration they'd been dreaming about, especially since I'd already committed to contributing $35,000. I tried to explain that I hadn't been hesitant, just surprised by the increased costs and additional requests. But Ryan interrupted me, his voice taking on a tone I'd never heard him use with me before. He said that Jessica had been planning weddings with her friends for years, that she understood the industry and knew what things really cost. He suggested that my shock over the pricing revealed how out of touch I was with current market rates and contemporary expectations. As Ryan spoke, defending Jessica's presentation and dismissing my concerns, I felt a chill settle over me that had nothing to do with the desert evening air. This wasn't the respectful disagreement of two adults with different perspectives. This was my son lecturing me about my own ignorance, treating my decades of financial experience as irrelevant because I didn't understand the luxury wedding market. I asked Ryan directly whether he really needed such an expensive celebration, whether there weren't ways to honor their marriage that didn't require such a massive financial investment. His response revealed how completely his perspective had shifted since his simple courthouse wedding just 2 years earlier. He talked about their social circle, their professional networks, and the importance of making the right impression on people who could influence their future opportunities. Ryan explained that their first wedding had been a mistake, too small and too simple for people in their position. He said they'd learned since then about the importance of investing in experiences that would pay dividends in terms of relationships and career advancement. He spoke about their celebration as if it were a business expense rather than a personal milestone, calculating potential returns on investment and measuring success by metrics that had nothing to do with love or commitment. When I asked about the guest list and Jessica's suggestion that my friends might not be comfortable at their venue, Ryan's response was even more hurtful than I'd anticipated. He said that Jessica was right to be concerned about the guest mix, that they needed to be thoughtful about the atmosphere they created. He mentioned that some of my friends might feel out of place at such an upscale event, and that it would be kinder to everyone if I limited my invitations to immediate family. The way Ryan spoke about the people who had supported our family for years made my chest tighten with a pain I hadn't felt since Miguel's funeral. These weren't strangers he was dismissing. They were people who had celebrated his achievements, supported him through difficult times, and welcomed him into their community whenever he visited. Linda had sent him care packages during college. Bob had taught him basic car maintenance when he couldn't afford a mechanic. The volunteers at the community center had listened to my proud stories about his accomplishments and treated him like family whenever our paths crossed. I tried to help Ryan understand how his words were affecting me, how painful it was to hear him dismiss people who had shown our family nothing but kindness and support. But he seemed genuinely puzzled by my emotional response. He said he wasn't trying to hurt anyone's feelings, just being practical about event planning and guest management. He suggested that I was being overly sensitive and making the situation more complicated than it needed to be. As our conversation continued, I began to recognize patterns in Ryan's thinking that I'd somehow missed during his childhood and young adulthood. He divided people into categories based on their potential usefulness rather than their intrinsic worth. He measured relationships by what they could provide rather than what they meant. He approached social situations as opportunities for advancement, rather than chances for genuine connection. When had my son become so calculating? When had he learned to view people as resources to be managed, rather than individuals to be valued? I thought about the years I'd spent trying to give him every advantage, every opportunity, every comfort I could afford. Had my sacrifices taught him that love was measured by what you were willing to give up? Had my constant support convinced him that other people existed primarily to serve his needs? The conversation took an even more troubling turn when Ryan began talking about my financial situation with a familiarity that made me deeply uncomfortable. He mentioned specific details about my savings account balance, my pension payments, and my monthly expenses that I had never shared with him. When I asked how he knew these details, he casually mentioned that Jessica had done some research to help them understand what I could afford to contribute. The idea that my daughter-in-law had been investigating my personal finances without my knowledge felt like a violation that went beyond anything I'd experienced in our previous interactions. I asked Ryan what kind of research Jessica had conducted, and his explanation revealed a level of intrusion that left me speechless. She had apparently looked up property records to estimate my home's value, researched average pension amounts for retired teachers, and even checked public records to get a sense of my overall financial picture. Ryan presented this invasion of privacy as thoughtful preparation, as evidence of how seriously they were taking their request for financial support. He said that Jessica wanted to make sure they weren't asking for more than I could afford, that they were being responsible and considerate in their approach. But I heard something entirely different in his explanation. I heard entitlement, assumption, and a fundamental lack of respect for my autonomy and privacy. I asked Ryan whether he understood how inappropriate it was for Jessica to research my finances without asking, how uncomfortable it made me to know that my personal information had been gathered and analyzed without my consent. His response was dismissive and defensive. He said that all the information was publicly available, that Jessica was just being thorough, and that I was overreacting to something that was actually intended to be helpful. The distance between my perspective and Ryan's seemed to widen with every exchange. What I saw as boundary violations, he saw as careful planning. What I experienced as pressure and manipulation, he interpreted as honest communication and reasonable requests. What felt like exploitation to me looked like family support to him. We were speaking the same language but living in completely different moral universes. As our conversation dragged on, Ryan's patience began to wear thin. He said he couldn't understand why I was making their wedding planning so difficult, why I was questioning every detail and creating obstacles instead of offering support. He reminded me of all the times I'd helped him in the past, suggesting that this request was just a continuation of the pattern we'd established throughout his life. That reminder hit me like a physical blow, not because it was untrue, but because it revealed how our relationship had been fundamentally misunderstood for decades. Ryan saw my years of sacrifice as establishing a precedent that entitled him to continued financial support whenever he wanted something beyond his means. He viewed my love as a resource that could be accessed whenever he faced the natural consequences of his own choices. I tried to explain to Ryan that there was a difference between helping him with legitimate needs and funding luxury desires, between supporting his education and subsidizing his entertainment, between expressing love through sacrifice and enabling irresponsibility through endless rescue. But my words seemed to bounce off him without making any impact. He had already decided that my reluctance to provide unlimited financial support represented a change in my character, rather than a reasonable response to unreasonable demands. The conversation reached its breaking point when Ryan suggested that my hesitation about funding their wedding revealed how little I cared about his happiness. He said that if I really wanted him to have a successful marriage and a bright future, I would find a way to support their dreams rather than focusing on my own financial security. He pointed out that I lived alone in a paid-off house with minimal expenses, implying that my savings were excessive and unnecessary, given my simple lifestyle. Ryan's words stung not just because they were hurtful, but because they revealed how little he understood about the realities of aging, retirement, and financial security. He saw my careful budgeting as miserliness rather than prudence. He viewed my savings as hoarding rather than responsible planning. He interpreted my desire to maintain financial independence as selfishness rather than wisdom earned through decades of experience. When I tried to explain why financial security became more important rather than less important as you aged, Ryan's response was both naive and cruel. He said that I was young and healthy, that I had years before I needed to worry about major expenses, and that I was using hypothetical future needs to justify refusing to help with his immediate dreams. He suggested that my fears about potential medical bills or home repairs were just excuses to avoid being generous with family. The final blow came when Ryan said that he and Jessica had already committed to many of their wedding expenses based on my initial agreement to contribute. They had signed contracts, made deposits, and informed vendors that payment would be available according to their timeline. If I backed out now, he said, they would be forced to break commitments and potentially lose money they'd already invested in their celebration. I realized in that moment that my son and his wife had used my tentative offer of support as collateral for expenses they couldn't afford. They had spent money they didn't have based on the assumption that I would provide whatever additional funding they determined was necessary. They had committed my savings to their dreams without asking my permission or even informing me of what they'd done. The conversation ended badly, with Ryan expressing disappointment in my attitude and me feeling more hurt and confused than I'd been since Miguel's death. After hanging up, I sat in my living room in the gathering darkness, trying to understand how the relationship I'd treasured most in my life had become so transactional and one-sided. I spent the next several days in a fog of sadness and reflection, replaying decades of interactions with Ryan, and trying to identify when our relationship had shifted from mutual love and respect to his expectation of unlimited support for whatever he wanted. I thought about the times I'd stretched my budget to give him opportunities I couldn't really afford, the sacrifices I'd made that he'd never acknowledged, the boundaries I'd failed to establish because I was too afraid of disappointing him. Linda checked on me multiple times during those difficult days, bringing meals I was too distracted to prepare, and sitting with me while I processed the painful realization that my decades of unconditional giving had created a son who believed he was entitled to take whatever he wanted from me. She didn't offer easy solutions or simple comfort, but her presence reminded me that I had relationships built on mutual respect and genuine affection, even if my most important family relationship had become something I barely recognized. On the following Monday morning, I drove to the community center earlier than usual, hoping that focusing on my students would help distract me from the turmoil in my personal life. But as I worked with adults who were grateful for free computer instruction and who treated me with courtesy and appreciation, the contrast with Ryan's attitude became even more stark. These people understood the value of what I offered because they had worked hard for everything they'd received. They expressed gratitude for small kindnesses because they knew that help wasn't guaranteed or owed. During my lunch break, I walked outside to the small garden behind the community center where clients sometimes sat to eat or make phone calls. The desert sun was warm on my face, and the quiet helped settle my racing thoughts. As I sat on a weathered bench and watched clouds drift across the mountains in the distance, I began to understand that I had reached a crossroads that would define the rest of my life. I could continue the pattern that had governed my relationship with Ryan for 37 years, sacrificing my own security and well-being to fund his desires and enable his sense of entitlement. I could liquidate my savings to pay for a wedding that excluded the people I cared about while impressing strangers who meant nothing to me. I could teach my son that love was measured by what you were willing to give up, and that family relationships were primarily about financial support rather than emotional connection. Or I could choose a different path, one that honored the values Miguel and I had tried to live by, one that recognized my own worth and dignity, one that refused to enable destructive patterns even when saying no meant risking the relationship I'd treasured most. I could set boundaries that protected my future, security while challenging Ryan to develop his own sense of responsibility and appreciation for what others had given him. The decision I made sitting on that bench in the Nevada sun would change everything, not just for Ryan and Jessica's wedding plans, but for how I understood my own value and how I chose to spend the remaining years of my life. I had spent 6 decades putting other people's needs before my own, and I was finally ready to ask what would happen if I put my own wisdom and well-being first. That afternoon, I made a phone call that would surprise everyone who thought they knew me, including myself. But before I called Ryan to tell him about my decision, I made another call that would prove to be even more transformative. I called the Henderson Community Foundation and asked to speak with someone about making a significant charitable donation. The conversation that followed would give me a sense of purpose and power that I hadn't felt in years, and would ultimately provide a far more satisfying use for my life savings than funding a wedding designed to impress people whose opinions didn't matter. The woman I spoke with at the foundation was named Maria Rodriguez, and her enthusiasm for my potential donation was both genuine and infectious. As she described the various programs that could benefit from my support, I began to envision ways to use my money that would create lasting impact rather than funding a single day of expensive entertainment. The possibilities she outlined made me realize that I had more power and influence than I'd ever imagined, and that my financial resources could be leveraged to help dozens of people achieve meaningful goals rather than enabling 2 people to live beyond their means. By the time I hung up with Maria, I knew exactly what I was going to do with my life savings, and I felt more excited and empowered than I had in months. The decision that had seemed so difficult just days earlier now felt obvious and liberating. I was going to take control of my own resources and use them in ways that reflected my values rather than someone else's expectations. I was going to demonstrate what generosity really looked like when it was freely chosen rather than demanded. And I was going to show Ryan and Jessica what it meant to make a real difference in the world, rather than just creating an expensive spectacle for social media. The meeting with Maria Rodriguez at the Henderson Community Foundation took place on a crisp Tuesday morning in April. I arrived early, sitting in my Honda in the parking lot for several minutes, watching other people walk into the modern building. With purpose and confidence, I wondered if any of them were there to make life-changing decisions like the one I was contemplating. The building itself was welcoming but professional, with glass doors and desert landscaping that seemed to promise both transparency and growth. Maria met me in the lobby with a warm smile and firm handshake. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe in her early 40s, with kind eyes and an energy that immediately put me at ease. As she led me to her office, she explained that she'd been with the foundation for 8 years, working specifically with individual donors who wanted to make significant impacts in their community. Her office walls were covered with photographs of scholarship recipients, community gardens, literacy programs, and other projects that had been funded through the foundation's work. When Maria asked about my interests and motivations for considering a donation, I found myself sharing more than I'd intended. I told her about my career as an elementary school teacher, my volunteer work at the community center, and my belief that education was the most powerful tool for changing lives. I mentioned my late husband Miguel, how we'd always believed in giving back to the community that had supported us, and how I'd been looking for ways to honor his memory while making a meaningful difference. What I didn't tell Maria, at least, not initially, was about Ryan and Jessica's wedding demands, or the family conflict that had precipitated my visit to her office. I wanted my potential donation to be evaluated on its own merits, not as a reaction to personal drama or family disappointment. I wanted to understand what good my money could accomplish before I revealed the circumstances that had led me to consider giving it away. Maria's presentation of the foundation's work was both inspiring and overwhelming. She showed me detailed reports about their adult literacy programs, which had helped over 300 people earn their GEDs in the past 5 years. She described their scholarship fund, which provided educational support for first-generation college students who couldn't qualify for traditional financial aid. She outlined their community garden initiative, which taught sustainable farming techniques while providing fresh produce for local food banks. Each program Maria described resonated with values I'd held throughout my life. The adult literacy work reminded me of my volunteer efforts at the community center, but with resources and structure that could reach far more people than I could help on my own. The scholarship program appealed to my decades of experience watching bright students struggle with financial barriers to their educational dreams. The community garden project connected with my love of growing food and my belief that self-sufficiency was one of the greatest gifts you could give someone. As Maria talked about specific success stories, I began to envision how my savings could be transformed from a static security blanket into a dynamic force for positive change. She told me about Rosa, a 52-year-old woman who had earned her GED through the Foundation's program and gone on to become a certified nursing assistant, tripling her income and providing better opportunities for her children. She described Marcus, a young man whose scholarship had enabled him to study engineering at UNLV and who was now working on renewable energy projects that would benefit the entire region. These stories moved me in ways that Ryan's wedding plans never had. Rosa and Marcus weren't asking for money to fund luxury experiences or social media content. They were using educational opportunities to build better lives for themselves and their families, creating ripple effects of positive change that would extend far beyond their individual circumstances. The Foundation's work was about empowerment rather than entitlement, about creating lasting value rather than temporary impressions. When Maria asked about the size of donation I was considering, I took a deep breath and told her I was thinking about giving everything. Not a portion of my savings, not a symbolic amount that would make me feel generous without affecting my lifestyle, but my entire life savings of $127,000. The number hung in the air between us, and I watched Maria's expression shift from professional interest to genuine surprise. Maria's first response was to encourage me to think carefully about such a significant decision. She explained that, while the Foundation deeply appreciated major gifts, they never wanted donors to sacrifice their own security or well-being for the sake of charitable giving. She asked about my family situation, my retirement income, and my long-term financial needs, making sure I understood the implications of what I was proposing. I appreciated Maria's caution and responsibility, and I assured her that I had considered the practical implications thoroughly. I explained that my house was paid off. My pension and Social Security provided adequate income for my simple lifestyle, and I had other resources I could access if genuine emergencies arose. What I didn't explain was that giving away my savings would also prevent me from being pressured to fund other people's poor financial decisions, but that motivation remained my private consideration. As we discussed the mechanics of such a large donation, Maria explained the various ways the money could be structured to maximize its impact. I could create a named scholarship fund that would provide educational support in perpetuity, with the principal invested and annual distributions funding student aid. I could support the adult literacy program with a gift that would allow them to expand their services and reach more students. I could fund the community garden project with enough resources to establish new sites throughout Henderson and surrounding areas. The more options Maria presented, the more excited I became about the possibilities. This wasn't just about giving away money to avoid family pressure. This was about creating a legacy that would outlast my own life, about using resources I'd accumulated through decades of careful saving to help other people achieve their dreams through hard work and education. The donation would honor everything Miguel and I had believed about the importance of community support and individual responsibility. We spent over 2 hours in Maria's office, discussing different programs, reviewing impact reports, and exploring ways to structure my gift for maximum effectiveness. By the time we finished, I had decided to split my donation among 3 programs: $50,000 for adult literacy, $50,000 for college scholarships, and $27,000 for the Community Garden Initiative. Each program reflected different aspects of my life experience and values, ensuring that my gift would touch multiple areas of community need. Maria explained that such a significant donation would require several meetings to finalize, including consultations with the Foundation's financial advisors and legal team. She wanted to make sure that my gift was structured properly for tax purposes and that I fully understood all the implications of my decision. We scheduled follow-up appointments for the next week, giving me time to gather the necessary financial documents and complete any required paperwork. As I drove home from the Foundation, I felt a lightness in my chest that I hadn't experienced in weeks. For the first time since Ryan's initial call about the wedding expenses, I felt like I was taking positive action rather than simply reacting to other people's demands. I was using my resources according to my own values and priorities, creating change that aligned with my beliefs about education, community, and personal responsibility. That evening, I called Linda to share what I'd done, though I still hadn't told her about the full extent of Ryan and Jessica's financial pressures, or the family conflict that had influenced my decision. I simply explained that I'd been thinking about making a significant charitable contribution and had met with the Community Foundation to explore my options. Linda's response was enthusiastic and supportive, reflecting her own commitment to community service and her understanding of how fulfilling it could be to help others achieve their goals. Over the next few days, I found myself looking forward to my follow-up meetings with Maria and the Foundation team. I gathered bank statements, tax documents, and other paperwork required for the donation process. I read through additional materials about the Foundation's programs, learning more about their methodology and success rates. I even visited one of their existing community garden sites, watching volunteers teach children how to plant seeds and tend vegetables. Everything about the donation process felt right in ways that funding Ryan's wedding never had. The Foundation's approach was transparent and accountable, with clear metrics for measuring success and detailed reporting on how funds were used. The programs they supported created genuine value rather than expensive spectacles, helping people develop skills and opportunities that would benefit them for years to come. The recipients of Foundation support were grateful and responsible, understanding that the help they received came from the sacrifices and generosity of others. As my meetings with the Foundation progressed, I began to understand that my donation would do more than just fund specific programs. It would also send a message about what I valued and how I chose to use the resources I'd accumulated through a lifetime of work and saving. Instead of enabling someone else's irresponsible spending, I was investing in education, community development, and individual empowerment. Instead of funding a single day of expensive entertainment, I was creating opportunities that would benefit dozens of people over many years. The Foundation's legal team reviewed my donation agreement carefully, ensuring that my gift was structured to provide maximum benefit while protecting my own interests. They explained how the scholarship fund would be administered, how recipients would be selected, and how the impact of my gift would be measured and reported over time. They also discussed recognition options, though I chose to keep my donation anonymous to focus attention on the programs rather than my personal motivations. By the end of the week, all the paperwork was complete, and the transfer of funds was scheduled for the following Monday. I would be giving away nearly every dollar I'd saved during my adult life, but I felt more confident about this decision than I had about any financial choice I'd made since buying my house. The money would be used to help people improve their lives through education and hard work, creating lasting value rather than temporary pleasure. On Saturday morning, 3 days before the donation transfer was scheduled to take place, Ryan called. His voice carried the forced cheerfulness I'd learned to recognize as a sign that he wanted something, or was about to deliver news he knew I wouldn't like. He said that he and Jessica had been doing more planning for their wedding and had some exciting updates to share. They'd found ways to reduce some costs, he claimed, and they wanted to discuss a revised budget that might be more manageable for everyone involved. I listened to Ryan's presentation with detached interest, curious about what new approach he and Jessica had developed, but no longer emotionally invested in their wedding plans. He explained that they'd negotiated with some vendors, found alternative options for certain services, and restructured their payment timeline to reduce the immediate financial pressure. The total cost was still significantly higher than their original estimate, but they'd managed to bring it down from the astronomical figures Jessica had mentioned during our previous conversation. Ryan's new proposal still required a substantial contribution from me, though less than the $50,000 Jessica had suggested. He spoke about their cost-cutting efforts as evidence of their responsibility and consideration for my financial situation, apparently expecting me to be grateful that they'd reduced their demands rather than eliminated them entirely. He seemed to assume that his revised request would be more palatable, and that I would be relieved to contribute a smaller amount to their celebration. When Ryan finished his presentation, there was a pause as he waited for my response. I could hear the expectation in his silence, the assumption that I would express appreciation for his efforts to reduce costs and confirm my willingness to provide whatever funding they still needed. Instead, I told him about my donation to the Henderson Community Foundation, explaining that I'd decided to give my entire life savings to support education and community development programs. The silence that followed my announcement was longer and more profound than any pause in our previous conversations. I could almost hear Ryan processing what I'd told him, trying to understand how his wedding funding had suddenly become unavailable. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a combination of shock, disbelief, and anger that made it clear he viewed my decision as a personal betrayal rather than a charitable choice. Ryan's immediate response was to question my mental capacity and decision-making ability. He suggested that I might be suffering from depression or cognitive decline that was affecting my judgment. He implied that someone had manipulated or pressured me into making such an irrational decision, and he demanded to know who had influenced me to give away money that should have been preserved for family needs. His reaction revealed how completely he'd assumed ownership of my savings, and how impossible it was for him to imagine that I might have my own priorities for using the money I'd earned. As Ryan continued to express his dismay and confusion, I realized that he genuinely couldn't understand why I would choose to help strangers rather than family, why I would fund educational programs rather than his wedding celebration. In his mind, family obligations trumped all other considerations, and my refusal to prioritize his wants over my own values represented a fundamental violation of maternal duty. He saw my charitable donation as theft of his inheritance rather than generous support for worthwhile causes. The conversation with Ryan lasted over an hour, with his attempts to convince me to reconsider becoming increasingly desperate and manipulative. He suggested that I could still change my mind before the donation was finalized, that I could redirect at least a portion of the money to help with wedding expenses, that I could find ways to support both their celebration and charitable causes. He proposed compromise solutions that would give them enough funding for a scaled-down version of their dream wedding, while still allowing me to make a charitable contribution. But I had already moved beyond compromise and negotiation. My decision to donate my savings wasn't about punishing Ryan or expressing disapproval of his wedding plans. It was about using my resources in ways that reflected my values and created meaningful impact. The foundation programs would help people improve their lives through education and hard work, while Ryan's wedding would simply provide expensive entertainment for people who already lived comfortably. When I made it clear that my donation decision was final and non-negotiable, Ryan's tone shifted from persuasion to accusation. He said that I was being selfish and vindictive, using my money as a weapon to punish him for not living according to my expectations. He claimed that my charitable donation was really about getting attention and recognition rather than helping others, suggesting that I was using philanthropy to make myself feel important and powerful. Ryan's attacks on my character and motivations were painful, but they also clarified the distance that had grown between us over the years. He could only understand my decision through the lens of manipulation and self-interest, because those were the frameworks that governed his own choices. The idea that I might genuinely want to help other people achieve their educational goals was incomprehensible to someone who measured all actions by their potential benefit to his own circumstances. The conversation ended with Ryan hanging up in anger, leaving me alone with the certainty that I had made the right choice for the wrong reasons from his perspective, but the right choice for all the right reasons from mine. In 3 days, my life savings would be transferred to programs that would help dozens of people over many years, creating opportunities and changing lives in ways that no wedding celebration ever could. And for the first time in months, I felt proud of how I was choosing to use the money that represented a lifetime of careful work and saving. The donation ceremony took place 6 months later on a bright October morning at the Henderson Community Center. Maria had suggested hosting a small event to recognize my gift and celebrate the launch of the new programs, though I'd insisted on keeping my identity private from the media and general public. The gathering was intimate, just foundation, staff, program coordinators, and a few scholarship recipients who wanted to express their gratitude in person. I sat in the back row of folding chairs, wearing a simple navy dress and my mother's pearl earrings, watching as Maria presented the impact report that detailed how my donation had already begun changing lives. $50,000 had expanded the adult literacy program, allowing them to hire 2 additional instructors and extend their hours to accommodate working students. Another $50,000 had established the Educational Opportunity Scholarship, which would provide college funding for 20 students over the next 4 years. The remaining $27,000 had launched 3 new community garden sites, including one just blocks from my house where I now volunteered every Saturday morning. The gardens were producing thousands of pounds of fresh vegetables annually, supplying local food banks while teaching sustainable farming techniques to families who had never imagined they could grow their own food. As Maria read the statistics, I thought about Ryan and Jessica's wedding, which had taken place 2 months earlier at a much smaller venue than they'd originally planned. I hadn't been invited, a decision that had hurt initially, but ultimately felt like the natural conclusion of a relationship that had been built on financial obligation rather than mutual respect. I'd learned about the ceremony through Linda, who had heard details from mutual acquaintances in the community. According to the reports that had filtered back to me, Ryan and Jessica had managed to fund their celebration through a combination of credit cards, loans from Jessica's parents, and contributions from extended family members who had been pressured to help cover the costs I'd refused to provide. The event had been elegant, but scaled back, missing many of the luxury elements they'd considered essential. Most importantly for them, it had generated the social media content they'd wanted, with professionally photographed moments that projected the image of success and happiness they'd been seeking. I felt no satisfaction in learning that their wedding had required financial compromises and borrowed money. My decision to donate my savings hadn't been about punishing them or proving a point about fiscal responsibility. It had been about using my resources to create lasting value rather than funding temporary spectacle. The wedding had happened without my money, proving that their demands had been wants rather than needs, preferences rather than requirements. The foundation ceremony included presentations from 3 scholarship recipients who had been selected for the first round of Educational Opportunity Awards. Maria introduced them as examples of the impact my donation would have over the coming years, though she referred to me only as a generous community member who believes in the power of education to transform lives. The first recipient was Carmen, a 34-year-old single mother who was pursuing a nursing degree while working nights at a local hotel. She spoke about the barriers that had prevented her from returning to school earlier, including childcare costs, transportation, challenges, and the fear that she was too old to succeed in a demanding academic program. The scholarship was covering her tuition and books, allowing her to focus on her studies without worrying about how she would pay for her education. Carmen's story resonated deeply with me because it represented the kind of practical assistance that could genuinely change someone's trajectory. She wasn't asking for money to fund a luxury experience or social statement. She was working toward a career that would allow her to support her children independently while contributing valuable skills to her community. The scholarship was an investment in her future that would pay dividends through decades of professional service and personal stability. The second recipient was David, a 22-year-old who had aged out of the foster care system without family support for college expenses. He was studying computer programming at the local community college, living in a shared apartment and working part-time at a grocery store to cover his basic living expenses. The scholarship was enabling him to reduce his work hours and focus more intensively on his studies, improving his chances of academic success and career advancement. David's presentation was brief but powerful, focusing on the difference between having educational opportunities and being able to access them. He talked about friends from the foster system who had wanted to continue their education, but couldn't manage the financial pressures of supporting themselves while attending school. The scholarship wasn't just funding his individual success. It was demonstrating to other young people in similar circumstances that educational goals could be achievable with the right support. The third recipient was Rosa, the same woman Maria had mentioned during our initial meeting months earlier. She had completed her GED through the Foundation's Adult Literacy Program and used her nursing assistant certification to secure a stable job with health benefits. Now, she was using her scholarship to pursue an associate degree in nursing, working toward becoming a registered nurse within 3 years. Rosa's story illustrated the compounding impact of educational support, showing how one program had led to another opportunity, which was now opening doors to even greater professional advancement. She spoke about the pride she felt in setting an example for her teenage children, showing them that learning never stopped and that it was never too late to pursue dreams that seemed impossible. Her scholarship was simultaneously supporting her individual goals and strengthening her family's long-term prospects. As I listened to these 3 recipients describe their goals and challenges, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with recognition or gratitude. These were people who understood the value of education because they had worked hard to access it. They appreciated the support they were receiving because they knew it wasn't guaranteed or owed. They were using their opportunities to build better lives through effort and commitment, rather than expecting others to fund their desires without corresponding sacrifice. After the formal presentations, I had the chance to speak privately with each scholarship recipient. Carmen showed me photographs of her children and described her study schedule, which involved getting up at 4 a.m. to review materials before her hotel shift. David explained his programming projects and his plans to specialize in cybersecurity, a field with growing demand and excellent salary potential. Rosa talked about her clinical rotations and her dream of eventually working in pediatric nursing. These conversations reminded me why I had chosen to donate my savings rather than fund Ryan's wedding. Education was an investment that multiplied over time, creating opportunities that extended far beyond the individual recipient. Carmen would use her nursing skills to care for patients for decades. David would develop technology solutions that could benefit countless users. Rosa would serve as a role model for her children while providing essential healthcare services to her community. The impact of my donation would continue expanding long after I was gone, creating ripple effects of positive change that no wedding celebration could match. The money I had saved through decades of careful budgeting was now generating compound returns in human potential, rather than sitting idle in a bank account or funding a single day of expensive entertainment. During the reception that followed the ceremony, I met other foundation donors and learned about their motivations for supporting educational programs. Many were retirees like me who had decided to use their accumulated resources to address community needs rather than simply preserving wealth for inheritance purposes. Others were successful professionals who wanted to give back to programs that had helped them during their own educational journeys. The conversations I had that day reinforced my conviction that I had made the right choice for my savings. I was part of a community of people who understood that resources could be used to create opportunity rather than simply accumulate prestige. We were investing in human development rather than material display, supporting achievement through effort rather than entitlement through inheritance. As the event concluded, Maria walked me to my car and thanked me again for the transformative impact of my donation. She mentioned that the foundation was already seeing increased interest from other potential donors who had been inspired by the success of the programs my gift had launched. My decision to give away my life savings was apparently encouraging others to consider their own charitable opportunities, multiplying the positive impact beyond what my individual contribution could achieve alone. The drive home from the ceremony took me past the community garden site where I now volunteered every Saturday morning. I could see families working in their assigned plots, children learning to distinguish between weeds and vegetables, teenagers discovering that fresh tomatoes tasted completely different from store-bought versions. The garden represented the kind of practical education that created both immediate benefits and long-term skills, teaching self-sufficiency while building community connections. That evening, I sat on my back patio watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose, the same view that had comforted me during the difficult months when Ryan's wedding demands had forced me to examine my priorities and values. The beauty of the desert landscape hadn't changed, but my relationship to it had deepened. I was no longer saving money primarily for my own security. I was living as part of a community where resources flowed toward opportunity and education rather than accumulating behind walls of individual anxiety. I thought about Miguel and how proud he would have been of my decision to support educational programs rather than enable irresponsible spending. He had always believed that the best inheritance we could leave was example rather than money, influence rather than wealth. My donation had honored his memory while demonstrating values we had shared throughout our marriage. 3 weeks after the foundation ceremony, I received a card in the mail with my name handwritten on the envelope in unfamiliar script. Inside was a photograph of a young woman in nursing scrubs standing next to a hospital bed, smiling as she adjusted an IV line for an elderly patient. On the back of the photograph, Carmen had written a simple message. "Thank you for believing in me. This is my first week as an RN. I will never forget your generosity." The photograph now sits on my kitchen windowsill next to pictures of Miguel and my thriving garden vegetables. It serves as a daily reminder that my life savings had found their highest purpose not in funding someone else's expensive party, but in enabling genuine achievement through education and hard work. Carmen's success was just the beginning of the impact my donation would create over the coming years. I still live in the same house, tend the same garden, and volunteer at the same community center where this story began. My daily routines haven't changed dramatically, but my sense of purpose has deepened. I wake up each morning knowing that my resources are working to create opportunities for people who understand their value. I go to sleep each night, confident that I've used my life's work to support others' dreams, rather than enabling others' entitlement. Ryan and I have had no contact since our final phone conversation about the donation. I don't know whether he and Jessica are happy in their marriage, or whether they've learned to live within their means. I hope they've discovered that lasting satisfaction comes from achievement rather than acquisition, from contribution rather than consumption. But their journey is no longer my responsibility. The most unexpected outcome of my decision has been the peace I've found in letting go of money I'd saved for decades. Financial security had been important to me, but it had also been a source of constant anxiety about potential future needs. By giving away my savings for purposes that aligned with my values, I'd discovered that the security I'd been seeking wasn't about accumulating wealth, but about using resources wisely. My life is simpler now, but also richer. I have less money, but more purpose. I've traded individual financial security for the satisfaction of knowing that my life's work continues creating positive change long after my working years ended. The legacy I'm building through educational support will outlast any inheritance I could have left, touching lives I'll never meet and solving problems I'll never see. Every Saturday morning when I arrive at the community garden, I'm reminded that the best investments are those that grow over time, creating sustenance and knowledge that can be shared with others. My savings have been planted in soil that will yield harvests for decades, feeding hungry minds rather than funding hungry egos. And that transformation, from money saved in fear to resources shared in hope, has given me a sense of completion that no amount of accumulated wealth ever could. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.